Hey, welcome to the Beyond the Business podcast. We got a special episode with us out here in Hawaii. Tim's out there in Texas. We just decided, hey, let's get this onto the book. Let's get this onto this season. Not push it to the next one. He's a co-founder, expert, and the co-founder of Cherry Tree. He's going to give us his insight on co-founding as well as startups on this show. Tim, how's it going today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is very impromptu, but we're ready, right?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, first off, right off the bat, we got 23 AI-generated questions. All I need you to do is just choose 3 numbers.
Let's 3 numbers. Let's go with what's the date today? Today's the 6th. Let's go with 6, 17, and let's go with 9.
Okay, question 6. How do you stay motivated and overcome obstacles in your field?
Yeah, that's a good one. I guess you could ask that to really anybody, right? But for me specifically with co-founders, I think one of the really interesting things about my job is that I get to talk to all sorts of co-founders. Last month I talked to people building AI tools, and somebody was starting like a coffee flavor packet thing. Somebody else was in healthcare. Somebody else was doing mining. And so I just get to talk to a whole bunch of different people. I think that's really, really fun. And so I guess that helps me, keep going, keeps me motivated, because the more I talk to, the more sort of diverse a perspective I can get. But at the same time, I'm realizing patterns that, don't really depend on the industry or the age of the co-founder, because a lot of these challenges are pretty universal and just human. And so that I think that's kind of interesting. And because every conversation is a little bit different, that keeps me going.
Love that. Question 17. Can you share a memorable lesson you've learned from a failure or setback?
Yeah, there's too many to list here. Let me think. Specifically with Cherry Tree, in the very beginning, we actually had a very different model. The current model has 3 parts. There's a newsletter that goes out. There's sort of one-on-one coaching that I do. And then there's also a cohort component of that for co-founders. Before this current iteration, I had a different idea. I had sort of this community that I wanted to build. Co-founders and entrepreneurs, there's a lot of us, but it's also a pretty tight-knit community. You and I have a ton of mutuals on LinkedIn just because we're in the same circles. And so I realized that nobody else really quite gets it. Like nobody knows what it's like to be a co-founder unless you're a co-founder. It's kind of like being a parent. Like you don't get it until you are one, right? And I wanted to get these people together so that we could all share tips and tricks and wins and failures, just because, sharing with somebody who understands exactly what you're going through, I don't know, it just feels really good, right? And maybe they've been there last year and they can help you navigate some of these challenges. That was my genius idea. And it made a lot of sense in my head. And I talked to, I don't even know how many hundred co-founders, and they all kind of said the same thing. They were like, yeah, this sounds good in theory, but I would never talk smack about my co-founder to these strangers, right? Or I never actually open up about the problems I'm having to strangers, even if I know they would understand. And so the idea of making it anonymous came to mind. And then that made me think about Reddit too much, and it just didn't work out. And so a lesson, not necessarily that I learned for the first time, but I was actually just reminded of it again, was sometimes an idea is really great in your head. You test it in the market and it forces you to pivot. And so that's sort of how I got to Cherry Tree in its current mode. Not necessarily the first time I learned it, but just learning it again from a different context.
Love that. And then question 9. What are your thoughts on the intersection of technology and just co-founding in general?
Any specific technology in mind, or business model?
Maybe AI. I know a lot of people have talked about AI when I've asked that question. Or just in general. I know you just recently started Cherry Tree, so it's kind of still in the startup stage probably.
Yeah, it's a good question. I see AI broadly helping with co-founder matching, which is not really what I do. I work with co-founders after they become co-founders, but I've seen tools use AI to match people based on what they're looking for, skill sets, personalities, location, and stuff like that, to find somebody to become a co-founder with. I think a lot of times that's really challenging as well. I think for me in particular, tech is going to be really interesting because like I said earlier, I'm noticing a lot of patterns, which means we can get to a point where a lot of this stuff is predictive, where based on a certain interaction or a certain challenge or a certain tempo or timing, I can sort of predict what challenges you're going to happen in the future. I already kind of do this sort of anecdotally, like I have a sense about it, but I don't really quite have the data to back that up yet. And that only comes with talking to so many hundreds of co-founders. I sort of have an idea, but it'd be really cool to see numbers behind it and actually get it to where it's systematized and like I have a structure and process for that. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah. Diving into the long question section, I would be interested to know maybe what are some of the patterns you're recognizing currently in your data?
Yeah.
Or maybe what are some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a good one. I see a lot of co-founder dating. So let me give you a little bit of context. If you remember Match.com, the dating site, how it worked was you made a profile and you browsed other profiles, right? And then if you saw a person you were interested in talking to, you'd essentially send them an email. Say, hey, I'm so-and-so. You're also in LA. Let's, get coffee or whatever, right? And the problem with that is it's scary. Like you don't know if this person is ever going to reply to you. You don't know if they're going to screenshot your message and laugh at you with their group chat of friends. Like you have no idea. You don't even know if they're going to see the message, right? And that's just really daunting and really time consuming if you're just sending a ton of these messages every day. When Tinder came along, obviously you have a swipe and match system, right? And so if you message someone and they reply, you can assume that there's already some level of attraction because they've matched on your profile, right? It's not a total stranger. You have some data as to whether they're interested in you or not. And so I see where we're at with co-founder dating, sort of in the transition between Match to Tinder. Before, when you wanted to find a co-founder, you either knew them through school or work, or you went to some networking conference, or you had a mutual friend, or whatever it might be. But now we have all these instant matching platforms like Coffee Space and Co-Founders Lab, and YC has their co-founder match, and there's subreddits for it, and LinkedIn is great. The problem with such a volume is that the quality of the relationships may suffer. And so if you think back to Tinder, if you're matching left and right, how many of these people do you actually talk to, right? How many do you actually, develop a relationship with? And so the problem with that is for entrepreneurship, just like the relationship, you need time under tension. Like you need to put in the hours to actually figure something out. The amount of hours you've spent interviewing people, you knew this podcast would have been a good idea, but you couldn't have just talked to one person and decided yes or no, right? I don't know how many guests you've had on before me, but I assume it's quite a lot. And you had to, practice this. You had your 23 questions and now this whole process nailed down. And so the same with co-founders. I see people matching really quickly. It doesn't work out and they scrap their startup. But think about that. Like, what does that do for your confidence as an entrepreneur? Or you think, maybe this is not for me. Maybe I've met with, 6 different co-founders and all of my ideas sucked and nothing got off the ground. And I don't talk to these 6 people anymore. So maybe I'm the problem, right? But a lot of times, maybe it's just you haven't put in the right amount of time and effort and energy into it to let it actually pan out. And so pros and cons of this like instant matching sort of world that we have right now, broad exposure, but now it's really up to you to really like dig into those relationships, those potential relationships and see what's there. So that's sort of the huge underlying pattern that I'm seeing, at least this year.
When it comes to those relationships, I think it's a lot like maybe like a group project for schools, like what I can think about it.
Sure.
And how I feel like some groups don't work well, some groups do work well. Yeah. I think what's important with co-founding, what's different though, is it's like a long-term thing, obviously. So you have to find someone that like cares about your mission as much as you care about your mission. Is that bad advice or is that the general advice you get? And like, how do you actually do that?
I don't think that's bad advice. Like when one of the number one questions I get is, like, what do I look for in a co-founder? Right. And you probably heard the advice to like find somebody with complementary skills. And, everybody's gotten that advice. You hear it everywhere. Business schools, conferences, like literally everybody says that. Right. And I think that's because it's easy to say, pretty universal. And it's not really like wrong. You can't really deny it. You can't be like, oh, you should not do that. Right. And so I think it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. And so you touched on, having complementary like personalities and, some people you just vibe with missions. Exactly. And vision for what you want. A lot of times people in the beginning stages, they have a really good idea of what they want now, like what their plan is now, what their skills and commitments are now. But as a co-founder, your job could change next quarter, next week even, right? And so you really need to find somebody who I think you have complementary personalities with and a shared sense of humor. And that's a really important piece. And so when you have those, the skills sort of develop naturally, right? It's in your best interest to get better for you at interviewing, for me at writing about co-founders, and being an engineer or whatever it is. You're naturally going to get those reps in and practice those skills. And so if you have a complementary personality and a shared sense of humor, and you develop that vision together, because that vision and mission is constantly growing and changing. What it is at one snapshot in time is probably not what it's going to be later. And so a lot of people sort of overlook that step. And I think that's a huge mistake. Hopefully that answers your question about that.
That's huge. Humor surprised me though. Describe me why humor.
That's a good one. I mean, the absurdity of entrepreneurship, right? You've probably been up late at night editing these shows and podcasts, and you're thinking to yourself, like, why the hell am I doing this, right? I've been there, we've all been there. And so I don't know, some of the best memories I've had with my co-founders are like staying up to 5 a.m. talking about life, or ask each other stupid questions, or we just have random stuff, like inside jokes and whatnot. And some of those are my best memories. Obviously we've done stuff that we're really proud of, and those are also great memories. But I think if you can't share a laugh about really just the absurd nature of starting a company together, you're not going to enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to survive. Like you're just not. Maybe if you, just suck it up and deal with it, you might survive a little bit longer, but it's going to be hell and it's not going to be worth it. So I think a shared sense of humor is really important.
I love that. I filled out some questions from my community, the community of 97 entrepreneurs out there that are just interested in entrepreneurship, taking their business to the next level. They had questions about co-founder fallout. What's the main co-founder fallout you see where they're like good, but then something happens and it just doesn't turn out?
Yeah, I think there's two main ones. The first happens with younger co-founders when you're sort of in a stage of life where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I've been there too. Like maybe you're in college, maybe you're getting your first job out of college, or you're switching jobs, or maybe you're starting a family, whatever it is, there's a lot of big life things that happen at the same time. And so sometimes there's different commitment levels. For example, one of my co-founders just went to law school. That's a huge commitment. And to start a company at the same time is going to be different from somebody who's just working a regular job, for example. And we see that a lot. And so it's not necessarily, somebody did something bad. It's just, life happens. Priorities change. And you kind of just have to talk to your co-founder about what is important, what you want to prioritize. So that's sort of for young, maybe first-time founders. The second thing that causes co-founder fallout is power/growth. And so one co-founder might outgrow the other because they're consistently taking on more responsibilities. That causes tension because the one who's growing is like, hey, why aren't you keeping up? And then the person who, is supposedly lagging behind is saying, well, it's either I'm trying, but I've got 2 kids to take care of, or whatever it is, or I just don't care that much about this company anymore. And so whatever the reason, they're going to feel like they're being blamed, and it's just a lot of tension. And so to get around that is sort of just to align expectations on, whose priorities are the most important right now for the company, and how to align those objectives, who gets the attention from the press, from the customers, from really anybody, the team. It's usually the CEO. So they naturally get a lot of exposure to all sorts of different people. And so they're going to be growing pretty quickly. And then you have to just sort of figure out personal dynamics between the two people, because they say when you're in a high stress environment, all your qualities are exaggerated, good and bad, right? And starting a company is definitely a high stress environment. So if you're naturally an impatient person, you're going to be very impatient as a co-founder. If you're naturally a very generous person, you're going to be a very, very generous co-founder. If that makes sense. So that was a pretty quick answer to quite a loaded question.
For sure. And what qualities do you think would be good for a co-founder, or just different? Because you said generous and patient, or just different in different niches or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends on what's compatible with you, right, as a co-founder. But broadly speaking, I think one of the things that applies regardless of who you or your co-founder is I don't know if grit is the best word, but I'll go with grit. for what I'm trying to capture. And I feel like this is overused. I feel like people say that all the time, like resilience and grit and all that, but I don't know. I kind of just have to echo that again and say that's so important for entrepreneurship. But I'll give you a better answer for co-founders specifically. What you and your co-founder, like the quality that you have to align on is risk tolerance. And if that trickles down to so many other things like grit. Because if one co-founder is willing to go all in and the other is not, that will cause problems. I'm not saying you both have to at the same time. I'm just saying that will naturally cause tension. If one person wants to invest a lot of their own money into the venture and the other person is hesitant, that will cause tension. And I'm not saying both co-founders should. Obviously it depends on each person's situation, but that will cause tension, right? There's endless examples of misaligning risk tolerance. Maybe you want to explore this new experimental product and add that to your line. Maybe your co-founder wants to double down on your existing products that are working. I'm not saying either one is right. I'm just saying that will cause tension. And tension can be good. Tension can cause you and make you to have those conversations to actually figure out which direction is best, right? That's the point of communicating and figuring these things out together. So it's not necessarily bad. It's bad if you address it wrong or don't address it at all, right? And so risk tolerance is something that should always be top of mind and that you should always be talking about.
I love that. Someone else was wondering, I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, is just how to find a co-founder.
This is a fun one. I mentioned a little bit about all those online platforms for meeting co-founders. I think there's a time and place. I think that's a great way to meet people, but no matter how you meet, you have to develop that relationship. Think about becoming co-founders similar to getting married, right? Tinder is great for meeting people. You still have to date them before you get married, right? It's not just you meet and then you get married. And so how you find them, I would say just cast your net as wide as possible. Talk to as many people as you can, not necessarily even with the intention of becoming co-founders with them. Just share what your interests and passions are. If you already have a product or company, share that with them, because who knows, like they might know somebody in that space that you should talk to, or maybe you just get better at pitching your idea, right? And so for somebody, I actually just talked to somebody who was asking me to help hook them up with a co-founder. I think if you're having trouble with a co-founder, there are a couple of reasons for that. One, you're not really selling yourself or the vision or the product. So you're not giving people a reason to work with you, right? You could be a cool person that they meet on the street and that's it. Or number two is you're just not that interesting. And that's not a bad thing. And I'll clarify in a second there. And the third one is it's too hard, or the distance is too far between what you're pitching and where you are now. So people don't really see how you're going to get there. And so I'll work backwards. Oftentimes it's a business co-founder who can't find a technical co-founder to help build something, an app, a website, whatever. I was this guy. I tried to use Figma and no-code app builders. I drew a lot of stuff on whiteboards to just give people the idea of what I wanted to build. When I showed that to them, it worked a lot better than just describing it to them, because they could see a prototype, like an early version of what I wanted them to do. And then they could easily decide if they're interested or not, right? The second thing was maybe you're just not that interesting. And so that's not a bad thing. I think everybody is interesting, but if you're talking to the wrong people, you will seem uninteresting. And so to try to talk to a whole bunch of different people, and not just people who you think would be good co-founders to you, right? I know people who are co-founders, like one guy's a 40-something-year-old ex-military helicopter pilot, and another guy, his co-founder, it was a 21-year-old engineering student, right? Like you would never think that they'd even cross paths necessarily, let alone be co-founders, but they work great together, right? And the first one, which I kind of talked about in number 3, was you're not really sure what you want to do yet. I know a lot of people who come to me and say, like, I want to do something with biotech or healthcare or education. It's like, sure, but that's great. What do you actually want to do, right? And when you can articulate a specific thing, like, I don't know, whatever, I want to use sensors to look at bacteria on your face and recommend skincare products. right? Like that is the actual thing, even though it's very, very complicated scientifically, they get an idea of what you want to build, right? So that was a very long-winded answer. So, but hopefully that answers the question.
Love that. Love that. To wrap up the show, I got 2 more questions. First,
Sure.
throughout this conversation, throughout the whole co-founder idea, I keep thinking of The Social Network. I don't know if you watched the movie Mark Zuckerberg and his co-founder.
Yep.
How is that? Is that like I know that's like a movie, right? And it's also like a real world example, but how often do you see situations like that?
More often than I'd like, but less often than you'd think, right? Because the movie is exaggerated. It is a movie,
For sure.
but it does happen, and it's not great. I actually just worked with a co-founder who was on the receiving end of that kind of treatment, and it's not fun. So you kind of have to look out for that. Maybe protect yourself a little bit, but don't be cynical. Don't overthink it. Yeah, it's not that common.
I love that. Love that. Just to wrap up the show, like I said, one last question. What would be your millionaire insight to the audience?
For co-founders?
Yep, for co-founders. Just your biggest takeaway from what you've been doing.
Oh, if I can only give you one, it's not even an action item or something to do. It's really just perspective. At some point, I'd spent more time with my co-founders than I had with anybody else in my life. More time with my co-founder than with my girlfriend, than with my parents, than with my friends. And so you're going to spend countless hours with your co-founder. So you might as well make them count. And when I realized that, I was like, damn, every minute that we're working together, it's either got to be fun or we got to make progress. If we're not doing either of those things, then we're wasting our time.
I love that. I love that. Thank you for hopping on the show. Thank you for your insight today.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.